If you or yell down the hall, we'll know. You're live.
Welcome everybody to live Q&A. I like to think that's how Jesus called Lazarus forth from the grave. Live!
From down the hall.
Yeah. Welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am probably the pastor.
I am no doubt the heretic.
Okay. Welcome everybody. Hi, Dan.
Hi. Good to be back.
Yeah.
Yeah, today, for all our jollity,
Uh-huh.
well, it could be a serious question. Then again,
Yeah.
it might fall right into the jollity, too.
Yeah.
The overall question for today is, did Christians make a mistake by splitting off from Judaism?
Mm-hmm.
And yet this obviously goes way back to the roots, where originally Christianity was just a division,
Yeah.
a sect within Judaism. So first, I guess the bottom line is, where did the schism happen?
Well, it's not like Martin Luther, right, where there's a clean break. Around the Great Jewish War and the destruction of Jerusalem starts coming the differentiation. Part of that is done by Christians so that because they don't want to get caught up in the Great Jewish War or the subsequent Jewish wars.
Okay.
Because there's like three of them, right, over
Yeah.
the course of Roman history. So part of it is a break on Christians' part because they don't want to get caught up. They want to kind of plead, this isn't us,
Now, why not? Why wouldn't they? If this is seen as part of Judaism, why would they not want to defend the mother religion?
Yeah, because Christians were never, because not even during the Great Jewish War were all Jews monolithic. The Great Jewish War was partially a intra-Judaism squabble, as much as it was. There were the hardliners who were leading the revolt, but, for example, when the hardliners took control of Jerusalem, they killed as many Jews as they killed Romans. Because it's also a quasi-class conflict. It's a quasi, intra-Judaism squabble as much as it is. No group is monolithic, right?
Yeah.
So it was as much a fight between Jews about who was collaborating with the Romans and who wasn't, as it was a fight for freedom against Rome, which it was that too. So Christians kind of over the course of the Jewish wars kind of say, we don't want to get caught up in it, so we're different than them.
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of it happens, is over the course of the first and second Jewish wars. Part of it was probably inevitable from the moment Peter baptizes Cornelius. Who's the first Gentile convert. He's a Roman soldier. Probably from the moment he does that, as soon as the Gentiles start being welcomed as full members of the community, that some kind of division there differentiation was probably inevitable. As soon as that happens, plus St. Paul doing his missionary work, the tenor was probably destined to be changed.
Is that destiny just because of volume, that there would end up being so many Gentiles?
Yeah, volume. To do that, both Peter and Paul basically explicitly reject dietary rules, and the church's eventual decision at the Council of Jerusalem is they don't have to follow dietary rules, right? So, as soon as those outward acts that define Judaism started saying, no, you don't have to do those, there's probably inevitable some break. You know what I mean? That was along the way. And then part of it is it wasn't done. You never get to classify or name your own movement, and so part of it was an outward perception. Part of it was the Romans started perceiving us as a different category of religion, and that shifted that shifted the tenor and the tone as much as our own understanding, right? Lutherans aren't called Lutherans because we wanted to be called Lutherans, right? We're Lutherans because other people named us Lutherans, and again, we're not a separate denomination because we wanted to be. The Catholics, the forces that be at the time kicked us out, right? And similarly, it was as much about a shift in Rome's legal classification of Christians that made it different as much as anything else.
So was that embraced by the early Christians when Rome did that?
Again, on the one hand, in the first Jewish war, it was like, okay, don't,
because we're being left out of the violence.
Yeah,
so
don't sweep us out in the mess.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
because wasn't Judaism a recognized religion, so it had protection?
Yes,
and that protection went away.
Right. Judaism is mostly a legalized religion. There are periods where it becomes unlegalized, but the Emperor Hadrian unlegalizes it for a while. But it was largely, especially at the beginning, it was a legalized, recognized religion, and so anyway, to sum this all quickly, it had its advantages during the Great Jewish War. Disadvantage was about a year during that same period, Nero starts blaming Christians for the Great Fire in Rome, and then starts.
I didn't realize he did that.
Yeah, that's Nero. So he blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome and starts rounding up Christians, in Rome.
Yeah.
And doing pretty nasty things.
So at that point, the schism did not serve Christians well.
Right. At that point, it didn't help, Okay. So, but by that point, that symbolizes that at that point, they'd kind of already recognized us as
something separate.
Something slightly different, So, yeah.
So did we, how long before we saw us as something separate, not part of the mother religion anymore?
Really soon, again, there's no clean break, but our earliest non-biblical sources don't seem to be talking about the religion that way, anymore. Mm-hmm. So
within a couple generations, it sounds
like. So quickly, again, probably from the moment Peter baptized Cornelius, mm-hmm. That's the fissure, from there, Cornelius.
Quick question was, who is Cornelius?
Right. So Cornelius is a guy in the book of Acts that is, according to the book of Acts, the first non-Jewish convert to Christianity. He's a Roman centurion that wishes to have him and his whole household baptized. And actually, it's this pretty hilarious moment because God has to convince Peter to go do this, but God convinces him with this vision in the book of Acts, and it's of all the animals descending on a sheet, cooked, that are classified as unclean according to Jewish dietary laws, and God says, eat. And Peter being Peter, it doesn't change. Peter has the temerity to argue with God and go, they're all unclean. And God has to look at him and go, you idiot. I'm the one who determines what's clean and unclean. Like I say, eat, it's fine. God has to tell Peter that 3 times before he, goes and does it. And then he finally goes and meets Cornelius. And so that's kind of so from the moment Cornelius gets baptized, mm-hmm. that's probably the fissure, Yeah.
That's interesting because, first thing that comes to mind for me is Cornelius is a great ape scientist.
Yes,
in Ape City,
right, in Ape City, right, and yes, plug, other podcast, plug. Yes.
And that's, so for us internally,
a
lot of this sounds like it was based less on theology and more on practicality, perception of survivability.
It's a little bit of both, right? The baptizing of Cornelius and the welcoming of the Gentiles is a theological issue. If that's the origin point, then it is a theology point, right? It's a who do we welcome as part? Who is God welcoming as part of the people of God? It is expanded beyond the original definition.
Yeah.
It is a bigger tent now.
Yeah.
And so that is a big theology issue. But, you can't ever just separate. Theology doesn't exist apart from the real world.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there are also real world concerns at the same time.
I guess a part of it for me is not understanding too why a complete separation versus something like the Samaritans, which I don't know if mainstream Judaism would
consider that a complete that would have been worse than a complete separate.
Right, because of apostasy.
Yeah, okay. They're apostate. They're less than They're less than Gentiles.
Wow.
They should know better, and they don't do better. At least Gentiles have the ignorance excuse. They don't, right? So that's worse.
Well, there aren't a ton of Samaritans left. Is that view still held, or are Samaritans
I don't
now
know.
welcomed back?
It is really just like one village. So I'm not, and it gets mixed up with modern, because that one village is also Palestinian. So it gets mixed up with modern Palestinian Israeli. The religious issue gets mixed up with modern political issues, so
it's kind of drowned out as a result.
Right. Yeah, that one village it's got a huge Hamas presence too, so it's it's mixed up in all sorts of modern political problems.
Yeah.
So,
Well, what about for us? You've talked before in the Q&As about how early on a Christian would go to synagogue, on the equivalent of Saturday, and then have their Christian meetings and get-togethers on Sunday, the next day after Sabbath.
Yeah.
When did that change? Because to me, that would signify the internal schism as being complete.
I mean, it starts changing the minute you get Gentiles in the group.
So even right there.
Yeah, right. As soon as Gentiles are in the group.
Because they're not going to the synagogue.
They're not going to synagogue,
they're
right.
just doing the Sunday thing.
Yeah, right. So as soon as they get welcomed in, as soon as congregations start becoming majority Gentile, which is, Paul's already wrestling with that, in the New Testament, right? Yeah. So again, from that, it's the fissure is incipient there from the very beginning.
Yeah. Is that the origin of why Christians don't worship on the Sabbath to this day? Why we don't do the seventh day as the Bible says? Yeah,
well, right. From the very beginning, Christians have been worshiping on Sunday.
Yeah.
The third day after the crucifixion. That's kind
so that's the significance. It's not that the Sabbath; it's the third day after the crucifixion. That's significant.
It's the day Jesus. You say it we say it on this. We say it every day at the communion prayer, right? We give you thanks because on this day you wrote, Jesus raised from the dead, and so yes, we worship on this day because this is when Jesus was raised.
Okay, that I didn't realize.
Yes,
I thought we just got confused.
No, This is because it's the day Jesus was raised from the dead. So every Sunday.
Yeah, I've always found it amusing how some people try to say no, Sunday is the seventh day, and it's like, no, for 5,000 years, Sunday's been the first day.
Right. Well, it still is on your calendar. So if you look on your calendar, it starts on Sunday,
End of story.
Yeah.
Well, Steve wants to go back a moment to the period where Christianity is just starting.
Yeah.
What were these different factions in Judaism? And how close were those different parties? Was could the war be cleanly separated between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, for example?
So those are two official parties. There's the and they are like parties. They each get representation in what's called the Sanhedrin, which is the council, the governing council, right? So there's
So it was more like Republicans, Democrats in the U.S. today.
Yeah, there's a religious component, but divided along religion, not along. Divided around religion and authority lines, not along purely political lines per se. The two are really mixed, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the Pharisees, and the Pharisees, their program is all about that people can be just as holy as the priests in everyday life. And so they've come up with this whole schema for being holy, for ways for them to live out the Levitical codes for priests in their everyday lives, and And
so that's why Jesus was closer to the Pharisees.
Right. So this is why Jesus is both encountering them and arguing with them more, because they're closer to Jesus' program. They're both about how do you be holy in everyday life, right? And so towards that end, the Pharisees are also the ones usually leading synagogues, right? Because the synagogue is a institution that's separate from the temple. It's a different thing, right? So that's the Pharisees. The Sadducees are the parties of the high priest at the temple in Jerusalem. And they are all about, no, this is like classic Judaism, this is classic Israelite religion. It is focused on the temple, do the temple festival, do the temple things, keep doing the temple things, And
along that line, didn't you have to genealogically belong to a certain...
If you were to be a high priest, you were, right, there. You had to be genealogically in the priestly families, right? But you could be a high priest. You could be of that party and not be a high priest. It wasn't just the high priests. It was, but it is they are the power of they are the party of centralized power, right?
Yeah. So that seems to introduce the class struggle element then too.
Yeah, right. So there's so that's the class element, is that the high priests and the Sadducees are also usually they're the party of collaborators. They want to work with the Roman occupation. They will work with the Romans. This is what sets off one of the revolts. Is it word gets out that the high priest let the Romans raid the temple treasury, which kind of starts setting off the revolt.
Okay.
Similarly, the Romans selected the actual high priest was selected by the Roman governor. They managed that process. So they're the party of collaboration. The Pharisees are kind of the party of like detachment. They're not going to be actively resisting, but they're not happy that the Romans are there. And
are the Pharisees, is that where the rabbinical tradition that we have today?
Yeah, so from? Rabbis, so you don't have Sadducees anymore because they get wiped out
with the temple.
Okay. Right? They're both their raison d'etre and themselves for existing just disappear utterly, right? With the destruction of the temple. And then the Pharisees, because they're the only ones who actually lead institutions like synagogues, which are separate from the temple, begin the evolution of Judaism into what we call, modern rabbinic Judaism today, right? At the same time, you have another party, a group called the Sicarios. Sicario means dagger, so these are the literal revolutionaries. They're also called the Zealots, right? So Simon the Zealot he would have been one of them. But it would have been one of this party, right? They're the literal revolutionaries. They are recruiting. They are going around saying, "We're running a revolution. Join us. We're going to fight the Romans." They're the people who launch the revolution when the revolts come, right? And then you have a group called the Essenes, which are responsible for what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they are like go out into the wilderness esoteric mystics, who think God's judgment is coming and the world is ending, so we're going to go off into the desert and escape this sinful whole world.
Yeah.
So John the Baptist probably comes out of that camp.
That's what I was going to ask, because given what John preaches, and even what Jesus preaches, it sounds like they were both Essenes.
Yeah, John at least is probably Jesus kind of exists in this weird. Jesus probably is not a member of any of these parties. He's in some ways he's got a similar program to the Pharisees. In other ways, he kind of seems like an Essene. Like he defies all these these parties in Judaism at the time.
He's kind of synthesized.
Yeah, he's pulled from each of their strands. So he's not with any of them. He's not for any of them. He's not. He's kind of against all of them in some way. So
Jesus have received some kind of rabbinical training? Because given the class that he was born into, that would have been highly illiterate. And
Yeah.
yet we have the scene in the synagogue where Jesus is reading.
Right. So he can read.
Where would he have, given
Yeah.
his class, where would he have picked up reading?
It's a very good question. I mean, he can read. He's called rabbi and teacher. So clearly people recognize that in him. He can give sermons. He can explicate scripture. He's good at both those things.
Yeah.
So clearly he can do all those things. So the Bible doesn't tell us.
This is part of that big gap in history we have.
Yeah, just that amorphous, what rabbi school did Jesus go to, and
Yeah.
he doesn't, we don't have a picture of him wearing Nazareth U,
Yeah.
on his.
No, but I wonder because it's, there's such a rich rabbinic tradition,
Yeah.
and really traditions with different schools of thought
Mm-hmm.
within the rabbinical history,
Yeah.
that it would be interesting to know where he did pick up, where he learned to read.
Yeah. We have a better idea of Paul than we do of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Probability is, a lot of kids at the time started rabbinical school, and it was,
Even with the poor class.
yeah, it was kind of like whoever could, but if you weren't good at it, they would tell you to go home, so, and that's kind of part of the call of the disciples is by the time the disciples are called, all these people have been told you're not good enough to do this, go home, and that's kind of the exact people Jesus calls. It's the people who've already been told, no, you don't cut it, So, but other than that, we don't really know. It just doesn't say.
Yeah.
You can assume that he knows, and the story of him in the temple at 11 shows that he knows a lot. Maybe he was just, it's like the Matrix. God downloaded, the rabbi training video into his head. I don't know.
I can do synagogue now.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Maybe that could be it. Because at 11 he's already
Yeah.
debating with the scholars and things like that.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, one way or the other, he sounds precocious. Even
Yeah.
even the non-canonical child gospels, he's
Right.
very precocious.
right. He's a precocious kid. So yes.
Wow. Well. Yeah.
When during that time, the people who would have been contemporary historians, observing what was happening, do any of them write about the movement of Christ?
And let's repeat the question.
Yeah.
Do any of the people who would have been contemporaneous historians, do they have any writings about Christ?
Yeah, so we get mentions of John the Baptist and Jesus from Josephus, who's writing in the 60s. Specifically, he's actually chronicling the First Jewish War.
Yeah. And just to clarify, you're talking about the '60s, not the 1960s.
Yeah, like 0060. Yeah, that's right. He's writing in the 60s AD, Specifically, he's a Jewish scholar who's been captured by the Romans and captured by the general that ends up becoming emperor, in the end. And he's a fan of that family, so he writes let me explain my people to you, with a very friendly tilt toward the emperors, and toward Romans. So he mentions John the Baptist and Jesus. He actually mentions John the Baptist more, trying to explain the politics of Herod in that group, There's a scholar writing a little later called Tacitus, who's one of the better Roman historians, who he doesn't mention Jesus, but he mentions Christians, very early Christians. He is very anti-Christian. He thinks we're the stupidest people on earth, and so he talks with us with as much derision as possible.
Is he one of the ones that said that Christians were cannibals?
No. His line
popular?
about us was we were the religion of women and slaves. Was his, which was true. But that's how he dismissed us, right? We were the unpatriotic religion of women and slaves. And then One of the fascinating things we get is when the Emperor Trajan is emperor, and that's a little later. It's like the 100s. We actually get a series of letters from a governor of a province. The governor's name is Pliny, to Trajan, because they were best friends. And Pliny is asking Trajan how to deal with all sorts of problems in his province. And we actually have the letters back and forth to each other. But there's a whole series of letters on what do I do with the Christians. He's governor of a province in Turkey, and his issue is he's been given an anonymous list of Christians in his province. And he asks the emperor, what do I do?
I've got these names.
I've got these names. Do I do anything with these names? Do I haul these people all into court? Do I investigate this? Do I ignore it? What's your guidance on that? Trajan's advice ends up being anonymous lists are categorically bad, so ignore it. If somebody's hauled into court with direct evidence of being a Christian, give them the opportunity to repent, and if they do, let them go. If they won't, then you got to execute them, but don't go searching them out, cause more problems than it solves. So those are our main non-biblical evidence pieces, through that kind of really early period. Besides other Christian writings, we get Justin Martyr writes the first, what we call the Apology of Justin Martyr. He writes it to Marcus Aurelius, trying to convince him as a fellow philosopher. Justin is a teacher of philosophy, and Marcus Aurelius was really into philosophy, so he's trying to convince the emperor, be okay with us. Here's why, and so
his philosophical, ontological
right,
reason.
and so he's writing all these things about why you should be fine with Christians as a Stoic philosopher, so that's one of the first non-biblical Christian writings we get, so does that make sense? Does that answer your question? So that's kind of the groupings of evidences we get. Yeah.
I just wondered if it was Christian movement was small enough that it didn't get much attention in the context of all the Roman.
And the question was, she was wondering if Christianity was just small enough that it didn't really deserve that attention from the broader.
It is small, although its actual size is always magnified by the fact that Christianity was more urban than it was rural. So the Romans are kind of more aware of it than they normally would be because it tends to be concentrated in the cities, But it is small. It's a class issue as much as anything else. By and large, Christians are not wealthy, nor are they citizens.
So hence the comment of it's a religion of women and slaves.
Right. It's a lower class phenom, also a lower class foreigner phenom. So this is partially why Nero feels it's fine to pick on the Christians for the Great Fire. Is that most of the Christians in the city of Rome were non-citizen, were illegal immigrants, basically. Into the city of Rome, and so he thought they don't have rights anyway.
So why not blame them?
And they're worshiping an illegal religion, so why not? Sure. So that tends to be its where it's concentrated, but it's also why it grows so fast. Is Roman society was, if you want to imagine Roman society, it's on a logarithmic scale, right? So you have the vast population of who are absolutely destitute poor. And then you have a group that's 10 times smaller and 10 times richer, whose only benefit is they're rich enough that they don't qualify for public welfare.
Wow.
And then you have a group 10 times smaller and 10 times richer than that, who are still scraping by. You have a group then that's 10 times smaller and 10 times richer than that, which we call the equites, which are, they're the upper middle class first, and even they're kind of just scraping by. And then you have the equites, again, 10 times richer, 10 times smaller, which are the lower class nobility, the knights, we call them, And then you have even smaller and tinier than that, but also 10 times richer, are the senatorial class, we call them, the true nobility. And then there's the emperor, who's so vastly more wealthy than everybody else. It doesn't even register on the scale. But if you imagine then that society...
That sounds like what American society is becoming.
Yeah,
now.
except, it's so much more than American society. It's really unfathomable, but if you imagine that society, then a religion whose direct message is, regardless of class, status, you can have direct access and salvation to the Lord thy God. Where do you think it picks up? Well, it picks up in that vast, underbelly that's actually mathematically so much larger than the rest of the population, And
it's a message that's going to resonate.
Yeah. Another way to put it, I was reading something that said of the 1.2 million people that were residents of the city of Rome at its height, only 100,000 lived free of public charity.
Wow.
Truly free of public charity. So, of some kind. So, if you want to think about that, 100 times, 10 times, right? The number of the nobility. There's this vast, unwashed, poverty-stricken population, which keeps...
Over 90%.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. Right, it's the true 90%, the 99%. It's the true, that society. So again, a religion that says, share all you have, give to the poor. You can have direct access to the Lord thy God, not mediated by those fools up there,
Yeah.
becomes pretty attractive pretty fast.
Yeah.
I
can definitely see that. We're out of time already, so just one last question, which may be too deep for today.
Yeah.
What did we give up? What did we lose when we went ahead with the schism and left our mother religion?
Well, I think we forgot that we haven't, what we lost is we forgot that we haven't really left, right? Because the Bible's pretty clear on this. Whatever grace we've been given, we've been given to it because of Israel, right? We're not our own thing that's separate. We are, the analogy the Bible uses, we've been grafted onto the tree of Israel, right? We are not the primary branch. We are an offshoot that's been kind of surgically implanted on Israel, but it's Israel's message. And in fact, the whole thing doesn't make sense unless it's within Judaism, right? But Christians, in various ways, and all of them pretty nasty, have been trying to say, no, we're not you anymore. That tree is useless or dead or whatever. And, the whole Bible's message is, from Jesus to Paul, is, no, you're actually, whatever grace you have received, you have only received because of Israel. And this is what Paul, what's written in Ephesians, right, is, once you were aliens to the commonwealth of Israel without hope in the world, says Ephesians, but now you've been brought near, we forget that, but we forget that first part, right? It's like without Israel, we're just aliens to this gospel message, and so we forget trying to be our own thing causes all sorts of real nastiness, which Christian history is unfortunately rife with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Man. So, in some sense, my opening question is moot in that we really haven't split off from Judaism in the deepest of terms.
Yeah, there's two different sins you can commit. There's what we call Marcionism, which is a heresy, which is...
Oh, it's right up my alley then.
Yeah. It says the God of the Old Testament is evil and the God of the New Testament is good, And
so they're actually two distinctly different gods?
They're two different gods. That was Marcion's theory. Okay. So from there, you can kind of go down the Marcion route, which is there's a clean break at the New Testament. We don't need them. Jews, the Old Testament, any of that stuff. So that's one error. The other error is what we call supersessionism, which means that the church supersedes Israel. And so that the church replaces Israel. It's not that we don't need Israel, it's that Israel's been replaced by us Christians, which is also not true.
So it is also a heresy.
Yeah. Well, that one's not formally a heresy, but it's considered really bad theology.
Okay.
It's if you're in that territory, you're in very poor theology. That's just bad theology. Not all bad theology is heresy,
Okay.
but it's usually very bad theology. And so the key is maintaining the middle path between those two dangerous problems, right? Maintaining a course that says we are our own thing. My favorite scholar, Walter Brueggemann, says the Old Testament leads equally both to Jesus and to Rabbinic Judaism, and it points both ways, right? And we as Christians go down the Jesus path, but you need to remember it can point toward,
The rabbinic path.
the rabbinic path. And you need to remember what Paul says in Romans 11, right? Like, all Israel shall be saved. That's the final conclusion, right? Like, God, Paul says it in that chapter in Romans, God is never unfaithful to his promises, and so all Israel shall be saved no matter what.
I have to say, personally, I like that.
Yeah.
There's so much wonderful, A, beauty of writing, and B, glorious reasoning, theological reasoning, in so much of rabbinic writings over the last 2,000 years.
I forget which rabbi in Nazi Germany said it, but there was some rabbi in Nazi Germany who said, you Christians believe that the Messiah has come and has gone and you are waiting for him to return, and we Jews believe we are still waiting. So I propose we wait together, and when he comes again, or comes back the first time, we can ask, were you ever here before? And I hope to God I'm on the podium next to him and can whisper, don't answer the question. Which I think is a good attitude to take.
That's a beautiful attitude.
Okay.
In the meantime, yes, we shall wait together.
And in the meantime, we're all waiting together, so yes.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much.
Yep.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.